Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle a pretty big question, one that's been debated for centuries, really. How much does the actual structure of a government, impact the way a society works? How do different systems shape how people think about the future, how they make decisions, even just how they live their everyday lives?
Yeah, it's a huge question for sure.
And to help us unpack all this, we're going to be looking at excerpts from a really provocative book called Democracy, The God That Failed. It's written by an economist and philosopher named Hans-Hermann Hoppe. Have you ever read any Hoppe?
I have, yeah. His work is, well, it's definitely thought-provoking. He really challenges a lot of assumptions about how we think about government. Like he really pushes us to look beyond just the structure of a political system, like whether it's a monarchy or a democracy,
Right.
and really try to understand how those systems influence the way people actually behave.
So it's not just about the label, it's about what's going on under the hood, kind of.
Exactly. And one of the most interesting concepts Hoppe uses is this idea of time preference.
Okay, time preference.
Right.
Honestly, when I first encountered that term, I was kind of like, what does that even have to do with government or society?
Right. It sounds kind of, well, abstract at first, but it's a really powerful idea. Basically, time preference is just everyone values things differently depending on whether they get them now or later. Would you rather have, say, $1,000 today or, I don't know, $2,000 a year from now?
Oh, tough choice. I think I'd go for the 2000 later. I like a good delayed gratification.
See, that right there, that tells us something about your time preference. You're willing to wait for a bigger payoff down the road. And that, believe it or not, that has huge implications for how societies develop.
Really? I mean, I guess I can see how being patient might be good for, personal finance, but for an entire society.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Saving, investing, building for the future, all of those things require a low time preference, right? You're basically saying, I'm willing to delay gratification now because I believe the payoff later will be worth it. And that kind of mindset is essential for economic growth, for technological progress, really any form of long-term societal advancement.
Okay, that makes sense. So if you have a society where a lot of people have that low time preference, they're more likely to be prosperous, more innovative, all that good stuff.
Exactly. But, and this is where Hoppe's argument gets really interesting, he says that government, regardless of its form, actually tends to increase people's time preference.
Wait, really? How does that happen?
Well, his argument is that all things governments do, like taxing, regulating, even just the threat of inflation, they create uncertainty. They make people less sure about what the future holds.
So, if you're not sure what the tax rate will be next year, or if your business might get hit with new regulations, it makes it harder to plan for the long term.
Exactly. And it can make you more inclined to just, grab what you can get right now, because who knows what tomorrow will bring. Think about how taxes impact your ability to save for retirement, for example. Is the government, maybe even unintentionally, pushing you towards a higher time preference?
That's a good point. It's like the government is subtly nudging us to be a bit more short-sighted.
It's something to consider, for sure.
But I mean, the government also does things that benefit the future, right? Like building roads, funding education. Those seem pretty future-oriented.
Of course. And those things are important, absolutely. But Hoppe's point is that even with those future-oriented things, the overall impact of government can still tilt things, tip the scales, towards a higher time preference for individuals. And this is where his argument gets even more controversial, maybe even a little spicy. He starts comparing monarchies and democracies.
Okay, this is where I start to get a little skeptical, I have to admit. Our whole modern world is built on the idea that democracies are the good guys, right? And monarchies, well, they're relics of the past. We associate them with tyranny, with, all those kings and queens in history books.
Yeah, it's definitely counterintuitive. But Hoppe makes a really fascinating argument. He says a king, because he views the whole kingdom as his own personal property, something he wants to pass on to his heirs. He actually has a built-in incentive to think long-term, like his personal interest, his legacy are aligned with the long-term health and prosperity of the kingdom.
So he's less likely to make decisions that would just benefit him in the moment, but might screw things up for his kids and grandkids down the road.
Exactly. Now, look, I'm not saying that all monarchs throughout history have been benevolent or far-sighted, right? There's been plenty of terrible kings and queens. But Hoppe's point is that the structure of monarchy, the incentives built into the system, are different compared to a democracy.
Because in a democracy, politicians are constantly thinking about the next election.
Right, and they might be tempted to make promises they can't keep, or spend money recklessly, or even rack up huge amounts of debt, all just to get those votes and stay in power, even if those actions are really harmful in the long run.
So it's like they're playing a short game while the king is playing a long game.
That's a good way to put it. And Hoppe argues that this short-term focus in democracies can lead to what he calls a depletion of society's resources. Like, we're using up our capital, our wealth, our future just to satisfy immediate desires.
That's kind of a scary thought, actually. It makes you think about, like, all the times governments make decisions that seem popular in the moment, but then end up having all these unintended consequences down the line.
Right, right. And Hoppe would say those unintended consequences are often a direct result of the incentives that are, like, baked into the system.
Okay, wow. This is already making me think about things in a totally different way. But before we get too far down this rabbit hole, I think we should clarify one term for our listeners, because Hoppe uses it a lot. He talks about the natural order of society.
Oh, good point, good point. That's key to understanding Hoppe's whole framework.
So what does he mean by natural order? Like back to nature, living in caves, no government at all?
No, not quite, haha. It's a bit more nuanced than that. Essentially, he's describing a society where individual liberty and private property are like the foundational principles.
So people are free to pursue their own goals, make their own choices, all that good stuff, without too much interference from the government.
Exactly. It's a system where individuals are empowered to make their own decisions, chart their own course, and then they bear the consequences of those choices.
So less about top-down control and more about individual responsibility.
Precisely. And Hoppe believes that this kind of system, where individuals are really empowered, is, well, it's more conducive to that low time preference we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he believes it leads to a more prosperous and flourishing society overall.
Wow, okay. This is already so much to think about. So we've talked about how time preference shapes individual behavior and how different forms of government can actually influence that time preference, nudging people towards a more short-term or long-term outlook. I mean, it really makes you wonder if even something as fundamental as our perception of time is shaped by the systems we live under, what other profound effects are at play?
It's a question worth pondering for sure. Thinking about this whole time preference thing, it's kind of interesting to think about how it might even play out in something like, I don't know, a nation's immigration policy.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Immigration. That's a really interesting connection. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before.
Yeah, well, let's go back to Hoppe's idea about a king, the one who views his kingdom as his property. Wouldn't he be, like, pretty darn selective about who he lets, come in and live there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like if you own a beautiful house, you're not just going to let anyone move in without, like, really thinking it through, right?
Right, exactly. And a king, thinking about the long term, the health of his property, that kingdom, he'd probably want immigrants who could really contribute, right? People who would add to its overall productivity and prosperity.
So people who bring valuable skills, talents, people who can help the kingdom thrive, basically.
Exactly. He'd be looking for folks who would add to the kingdom's wealth, help make it more stable, more likely to flourish over generations.
Okay, that makes sense for a king. But how would that contrast with, like, a democracy's approach to immigration? Because, I mean, we've talked about how democracies, while they strive to be fair and compassionate, sometimes they can get kind of caught up in that short-term thinking.
Right, right. And Hoppe would argue that in a democracy, there's often this pressure, right? This pressure to do what seems beneficial or compassionate in the moment, even if it might have negative consequences down the road. It's like this balancing act,
So, like, a democratic leader might feel compelled to, I don't know, open the borders really wide to a huge influx of immigrants, even if that might put a strain on resources or maybe even, like, disrupt the social fabric in the long run.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure. It's not about easy answers.
No.
But Hoppe's point is that the incentives in a democracy, they can sometimes lead to decisions that are more about, short-term political gain than about the long-term well-being of the society as a whole. It's tricky. He's not saying one system is, like, inherently good or bad, right? Yeah. He's just saying that the way they're structured, it influences the kinds of decisions that get made, the kinds of policies that are likely to be put in place.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It's all about incentives, right? It really makes you think about the trade-offs that are involved in any political system. Like, there's no perfect solution, it seems like. But But understanding these underlying dynamics, it can at least help us, make more informed choices, maybe.
Absolutely. And I think it also highlights how important it is to really think, to think critically and to think about the long-term consequences of our actions, both individually, but also, as a society.
For sure. For sure. Now, another area where Hoppe kind of digs into these potential pitfalls of democracy is in its approach to social welfare and the redistribution of wealth. And to be honest, this is where things get even more controversial, maybe.
Right, right. This is where we start to see the tension between, you know, between individual responsibility
Yeah.
and the role of government, right? Like the role of government in providing for its citizens.
Because on the one hand, you have the very real need to help people who are struggling, people who need a helping hand to get back on their feet. But then on the other hand, you have the concern that if those safety nets become too big or too generous, does it discourage people from working hard and taking care of themselves? It's a tough question.
It is. It's a real dilemma. And Hoppe argues that democracies, because of the way they're structured, their inherent structure, they tend to lean towards excessive redistribution and these, big welfare programs.
Really? Why is that? I mean, you would need a majority of people to actually vote for these policies, right?
You would. You would. But Hoppe's point is that in a democracy, there's this strong incentive for politicians to cater to the needs of the majority, even if it means maybe neglecting the interests of the minority or even like sacrificing the long-term economic stability of the whole country. It's tough.
So if a large part of the population relies on government assistance, they're more likely to vote for politicians who promise to keep those programs going or even expand them, right?
Exactly. And that can create this kind of feedback loop, right? Where more and more people become dependent on the government, and then that leads to higher taxes and then, an even larger welfare state. It can be a slippery slope in a way.
Yeah, I see that. But wouldn't those higher taxes also discourage work and investment? I mean, wouldn't it end up hurting the economy overall?
That's exactly Hoppe's concern.
Mhm.
He argues that too much redistribution, too many welfare programs can actually undermine the foundation of a prosperous society. Like it can lead to economic stagnation and a decline in, individual initiative and all that.
Wow, this is really challenging how I think about the role of government.
Yeah.
Because we want a system that's compassionate, that takes care of people who are struggling, but we have to think about the long-term effects of those policies, right? Like, do they create a culture of dependency? It's a lot to consider.
It is. It is. It's this delicate balance. And, well, Hoppe believes that democracies are, they're particularly susceptible to getting that balance wrong.
So if democracies aren't the ideal solution and monarchies, well, they have their own problems too, as we talked about, then what does Hoppe propose as a better way to organize society? What's the alternative?
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. Hoppe is a big proponent of secession and decentralization. He believes that smaller, more localized forms of government they're better suited to actually meet the needs of their citizens and to really foster that individual liberty and economic prosperity.
Hold on, wait. Secession, like actually breaking apart countries into smaller units, that sounds pretty extreme, doesn't it? Isn't that, I don't know, something we associate with historical conflicts, political upheaval, all that?
Yeah, it definitely has that, that historical baggage. But Hoppe, he envisions a system of peaceful and voluntary secession, like where individuals and communities, they have the right to choose, what kind of political structures they want to live under. It's about choice in a way.
Okay. I'm intrigued, but I also have a lot of questions. Like, how would that actually work in the real world? And what about, things like national defense? Like, how would smaller independent communities protect themselves?
Those are all valid questions for sure. And ones that we'll explore in more detail in the final part of this deep dive.
Okay, good, because my brain is already spinning with all of this.
But the core idea here, right? The core idea is that by decentralizing power and giving individuals more autonomy over their own lives, you can create a society that's more responsive to their needs, their aspirations.
It's a radical concept, that's for sure. But I guess it's worth grappling with, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a world where more and more people are, questioning the way things are, and they're looking for new ways to organize society, to govern themselves.
Exactly.
All right, so we're back, and we're diving right back into Hoppe's Democracy, The God That Failed. And Honestly, I gotta say, my head's still spinning a bit from, from that last discussion about secession and all that. It's a lot to process.
I know, right? It's definitely some heavy stuff. Hoppe really throws down a challenge when he starts talking about, actually breaking up countries into these smaller independent units. It's so different from how most of us think about government and society and all of that.
Yeah, it almost feels like, like you're not even supposed to talk about it.
Yeah.
Like it's this taboo subject or something. But I have to admit there's a part of me that's kind of drawn to this idea of, of people having more control over their own lives, their own communities.
Right. Like this idea of self-determination,
Yeah.
right? It's an inherently appealing in a
Yeah.
way. But I think a lot of people, when they hear the word secession, they immediately picture, like violent revolutions or countries just like falling apart into chaos.
Exactly. Like, wouldn't it just lead to constant, instability, conflict, all that? And what about things like national defense? Like, how would all these little, independent communities actually protect themselves, especially against like bigger threats?
Those are all, yeah, totally legitimate concerns. And Hoppe, he actually addresses them in his work, but his vision of secession, it's not about violence or force. It's more about peaceful, voluntary separation. It's like individuals and communities choosing to go their own way,
Yeah.
but through mutual agreement, not through some kind of like bloody conflict.
So more like, I don't know, more like a conscious uncoupling than a messy divorce.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. And he actually believes that this kind of system, this decentralized system where power is more spread out,
Oh,
he thinks it would lead to a more stable and peaceful world overall.
really? That's
Yeah.
interesting. But how, I mean, why would smaller governments be less likely to, to start wars or get into conflicts?
Well, his argument is that, smaller, more localized governments, they're just inherently like less likely to engage in those big, large-scale conflicts. It's kind of like that old saying, all politics is local. Maybe people felt more connected to their governments, if they had more of a say in how things are run in their own communities, they'd be less inclined to support, those policies that lead to conflict and war.
That's an interesting thought. And wouldn't there also be more like, more variety in how things are done, more experimentation, more innovation?
Exactly. That's another key part of Hoppe's argument. He believes that competition between these smaller political units, it would be a real driving force for progress. Just like competition in the marketplace, leads to better products and lower prices. He thinks that competition between communities, it would incentivize them to create really attractive living and working environments so
Sure.
they could attract, residents and businesses and all that.
Oh, yeah. So instead of everyone being like stuck with this one size fits all approach, dictated by some big central government, you'd have this whole ecosystem of different communities. And each one would be like experimenting with their own unique ways of doing things.
Right. And people could actually choose.
Right.
They could choose to live in the community that best aligned with their own values, their own preferences, all that. It's a really fascinating vision for sure. Though, I mean, it's not without its challenges, obviously.
Yeah, and I'm still kind of stuck on the whole, national defense thing. Like, how do all these smaller communities, how do they actually like band together to protect themselves, especially if there's, some big threat out there?
Well, Hobbes suggests that instead of relying on, just one big centralized military, these communities, they could form voluntary alliances
Yeah.
and they could create like mutual defense pacts.
So it's more decentralized, but he thinks it would be more effective.
He does, yeah.
Yeah.
He argues that it would be more effective and also, less prone to overreach. Like it wouldn't be so easy for governments to just, start wars or get involved in conflicts that maybe don't even concern them.
Oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of see that. So it's more like a network of cooperating communities, right? Instead of just one big, monolithic superpower. It's definitely a different way of thinking about security.
It is. And Hoppe, he points to historical examples too, of how smaller independent entities they've actually been able to defend themselves really effectively against much larger powers.
Oh, like who? What are some examples?
So he talks about the Swiss cantons, for example.
Yeah.
They managed to maintain their independence for centuries, even though they were surrounded by by much larger or more powerful countries. And even the city-states of ancient Greece, they held their own for quite a while too.
Oh, right. That's a good point. I mean, it's easy to forget that the nation state, as we know it today, it's a relatively recent thing. Like for most of human history, people lived in smaller, more decentralized communities, and they somehow managed to survive, to even thrive.
Exactly. And Hoppe believes that, a return to this kind of model, this decentralized model, it could actually unleash a wave of, of creativity and innovation and lead to a more prosperous, a more fulfilling society overall.
Wow. Okay. It's definitely a bold vision and a thought-provoking one. It really challenges us to rethink some of those fundamental assumptions about how society should be organized, how power should be distributed.
Right. And whether you agree with him or not, I think, Hoppe's work, it forces us to engage with some really, really important questions about the role of government, the nature of individual liberty, the kind of future we want to create.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about Hoppe's ideas specifically, but also just about how to think differently about the systems we live under and the choices we make, as individuals and as a society.
I totally agree. It's been a real mind-stretching experience for me too. And I
Mhm.
I really hope our listeners are walking away with at least a renewed sense of curiosity,
Mhm.
and a willingness to maybe question some of their own assumptions about how the world works, about how things could be different.
Because ultimately, that's what this is all about, right? That's what a deep dive is all about. It's about exploring new ideas, questioning the conventional wisdom, and really trying to expand our understanding of what's possible. So, thanks for joining us on this intellectual adventure. It's been quite a ride.
It has. Thanks for having me.